welcome back to our last keynote speaker here in the spring seminar on spectrology, ghosts, and haunting. Our last keynote speaker is Professor Esther Peeren. She's a professor of cultural analysis at the University of Amsterdam and academic director of the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis. She directs the ERC-funded project Imagining the Rural in a Globalizing World. Recent publications include Spectral Metaphor, Living Ghosts and the Agency of Invisibility, and the edited volumes Global Cultures of Contestation and Other Globes, Past and Peripheral Imaginations of Globalization. All of these books published by Palgrave. She's also edited The Spectralities Reader, Ghosts and Haunting in Contemporary Cultural Theory, which is a book that was mentioned in some of our presentations throughout the 3 days. She has co-edited with Maria del Pilar Blanco, and it was published by Bloomsbury. Today, Professor Esther will be presenting her communication under the title Living Ghosts of the Spectralized Rural. In this paper, she will explore the spectralization of the rural in the context of intensified globalization and impending environmental disaster. She argues that such obfuscated rural lives manifest in cultural imaginations as living ghosts that are not counted as present by those who maintain a cruelly optimistic investment in the idyll and pastoral genres. She also argues that these living ghosts demand to be made visible as spectralized and to find different genres in which they can be counted as present. For that purpose, she will discuss the rural set British television crime drama Midsomer Murders, the 2006 novel The Long Drive by Cynan Jones, and Ben Smith's 2019 climate change novel Doggerland. This was a bit very brief synopsis of this next keynote speaker. And Professor Esther, thank you so much for being here with us. It's an honor for all of us to listen to your knowledge and to share with you this moment. You can start when you feel comfortable. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I would really much rather have been there with you in Porto, but this is the best we can do for the moment. So as you already said, my lecture is titled Living Ghosts of the Spectralized Rural, and I'm going to read it because by Friday afternoon, my brain is so zoomed out that I cannot really speak spontaneously. So bear with me. In academic and public debates about globalization, as well as in cultural representations of globalization, the main focus has been on the urban environments where a majority of the world population now lives. The rural has been much less reflected upon as a dynamic side of globalization. As Gayatri Spivak puts it, in the Global South in particular, globalization has prompted a spectralization of the rural, involving its conversion into a database for pharmaceutical dumping, chemical fertilizers, patenting of indigenous knowledge, big dam building, and the like. In the global north, too, the rural harbors some of the less palatable and not readily visible pillars of globalization, such as mega farms and landfills. Importantly, Spivak also sees the rural as a resource for an alternative to urban-driven globalization. She looks to the Cuban revolutionary José Martí's ruralist left humanism for a way to counter the spectralization of the rural, not with a return to nationalism or localism, but with an internationalism that can shelter planetarity. According to Spivak, Martí allows the rural's long-standing connection with the metaphor of nature or earth to challenge and move beyond the privileging of the idea of city-nation by figuring the rural as placing history itself in the forces of nature and thus away from the specificity of nations. Still, Spivak's warning that a rural-derived planetarity should avoid a primitivist romanticization of the rural remains pertinent, as especially in the global north, an undeniable factor in determining what does and does not become visible of the globalized rural is the continued dominance across the social and cultural realms of the genre of the idyll, which associates the rural with an escape from globalization. Although over the course of its long history, the idyll has taken different forms, all of these, in the words of the geographer Brian Short, entail a certain mystification of rural activities that works to naturalize and legitimate particular, usually conservative social relations. Some of the idyll's incarnations have proven particularly persistent and linger as ghosts in contemporary perceptions and portrayals of the rural across the world. According to Michel Bachtin, what allows the idyll to persist in literature and in life is a deep-seated longing for the core idyllic notion of a small but secure and stable little world of the family, where nothing is foreign or accidental or incomprehensible. A world diametrically opposed to the intensely interconnected one of globalization. As a genre, the idyll provides, in the words of Lauren Berland, an affective expectation of the experience of watching something unfold, whether that thing is in life or in art. A framing for the event that predetermines how it will be reacted to. A waning of genre is what should occur when the event no longer fits the generic frame. In this situation, there are two options. One is to continue to see the event as if it's still accorded with the affective expectation, so that one can keep reacting to it in the same way. This involves an act of disavowal. The other is to adjust the response to the event's actuality, departing from the generic framing. This will cause the genre to be reconfigured or discarded. Berland contends that the latter option is more constructive, as it involves an acknowledgement that certain genres are no longer attuned to social reality. The former, however, is more commonly chosen, as people are inclined to hold on to familiar genres like the idyll, even when these prove unable to deliver the conventional good life fantasies they promise. Berland associates the tendency to hold on to familiar genres that can ultimately only disappoint with an affective structure she calls cruel optimism, arising when something you desire is actually an obstacle to your flourishing. Optimism involves the revisiting of a scene of fantasy like the rural idyll in the expectation that this time nearness to this thing will help you or the world to become different in just the right way. Such optimism turns cruel when the very pleasures of being inside a relation have become sustaining, regardless of the content of the relation. When relating to the rural through the genre of the idyll makes people feel comfortable, even though this blinds them to the aspects of rural reality that make the idyll's good life fantasy unrealizable, cruel optimism is in play. In this lecture, I will explore how certain rural lives are rendered spectral, not fully visible or viable, by the cruelly optimistic adherence to the genre of the rural idyll. Such spectral rural lives include the poor, criminals, adolescents, travelers, people of color, seasonal farm workers, migrants and refugees, farm animals, and pollutants and pathogens. I will begin by arguing that conceiving of these others as living ghosts illuminates how they are dispossessed by being evacuated from visibility and what effect this has. Drawing on my own work on Jacques Derrida and on Akira Lippitt, I will contend that when dealing with the invisible lives of the rural, it is crucial to ask in what exact sense these lives are invisible and what each form of invisibility makes possible or impossible. Next, I will turn to three case studies: the popular television crime drama Midsomer Murders, set in rural England, the 2006 novel The Long Dry by Conan Jones, set on a Welsh farm, and the 2019 novel Doggerland by Ben Smith, set on a wind farm in the North Sea in a dystopian future of social and environmental collapse. My discussion of the 2011 controversy around statements made by a Midsomer Murders producer to legitimate the lack of ethnic minority characters on the show highlights how before and after the controversy, Midsomer Murders affirms the Rural Idyll's construction of the English countryside as a space of whiteness. With regard to the long dry, I argue that it exposes the Rural Idyll as a waning genre whose good life fantasy is no longer viable under the conditions of present-day globalization. In addition, Jones's novel acknowledges the non-human actors normally rendered invisible in the Rural Idyll. The possibility for a post-human idyll adequate to the globalized rural that this conjures will be outlined by way of the work of Karen Barat. Finally, Doggerland presents the living ghosts of the rural, which has been displaced from land onto water, as carving out modes of survival that are predicated on a repurposing and rescaling of the idyll's cyclical temporality. In the spectral metaphor, I wrote about certain people appearing in the present and while still alive as dispossessed ghosts. They are rendered invisible and considered exploitable and expendable, or sometimes simultaneously turned into objects of intense fear and violent extermination. The way in which such living ghosts oscillate between, to put it in the terms of Karen Barat, being absented and being counted as present underscores how the spectral metaphor can function as a means of calling attention to present processes of marginalization. As Barat indicates, moreover, whether someone or something will be counted as present and for what their presence is then seen to count is qualified by a for whom. For whom is this someone or something present? And is this someone or something present to them as to be cared for and safeguarded, or as to be disregarded and destroyed with impunity? The for whom complicates the assumption that all ghosts and all those who live like ghosts have the power to haunt, with haunting taken as a form of agency that insistently draws attention, forcefully demands a response, and has a disturbing impact on the haunted. Yet, as popular culture teaches us, not all ghosts are able to haunt with the same force, and some do not manage to haunt at all. If a ghost is present without seizing the interest and attention of the haunted, no haunting occurs. To haunt in a manner that would effectively counteract their marginalization, living ghosts need to be seen, acknowledged, and counted as present, or as Judith Butler puts it, as grievable, and therefore to be safeguarded in life and in death, by those who make them into living ghosts. Thus, the status of being like a ghost ought to be separated from the capacity to haunt. Haunting is not something ghosts are able to do of their own accord, but is fundamentally relational, involving a for whom. Much like the ghost's power to haunt, the ghost's invisibility too is not straightforward. All living ghosts participate in a certain invisibility, but this invisibility is not of a singular, invariable kind, as Derrida has shown. In The Gift of Death, he first distinguishes the visible-invisible, which denotes something that would be visible if it were out in the open, but that remains unseen because it is kept in secret. Crucially, there is in the visible-invisible a potential for exposure by the secret keeper, once again invoking the relationality of the for whom. Second, Derrida discusses the absolute invisible, which falls outside the register of sight and includes, besides what may be apprehended through the other senses, the divine gaze by which God sees me. He looks at me in secret, but I don't see him. I don't see him looking at me, even though he looks at me while facing me. In Spectres of Marx, this divine gaze reappears as the visor effect, the incomparable power of the ghost, specifically that of Hamlet's father, who appears in full armor, to see without being seen. This power, Derrida stresses, is enhanced by the fact that the visor retains the capacity to see without being seen, even when it is up, by virtue of remaining an available resource and structure for resisting identification. Here, Derrida ignores that in Hamlet, the armor is precisely what allows the ghost to be identified as that of King Hamlet, and thus as a ghost Hamlet is open to being haunted by. Living ghosts that nobody identifies with generally cannot partake in the power of the visor effect. Not absolutely invisible, but manifestly there in the social realm, living ghosts are either hidden and thus visible invisible, like irregularized migrants kept in secret as they are smuggled across borders, or apprehended in the mode of what Akira Lippitt calls avisuality. Avisuality not as a form of invisibility in the sense of an absent or negated visibility, not as the antithesis of the visible, but as a specific mode of impossible, unimaginable visuality. Presented to vision, there to be seen, the avisual image remains in a profoundly irreducible manner unseen, or rather it determines an experience of seeing, a sense of the visual, without ever offering an image. Avisuality marks something that is presented to vision and can potentially be captured by vision, but that is nevertheless not seen. It is what one cannot imagine seeing in the sense of acknowledging it and counting it as present, allowing it to become part of one's field of vision as an image offered by another. The avisual exceeds the capacity of the spectator to see it, to withstand its very spectacularity. It is a blinding image, an image unseen in what it, on its own terms, shows. Avisuality is concretized as a relational structure when Lippitt links it to Ralph Ellison's novel, Invisible Man. The invisible man's avisuality means that its blackness and the prejudices associated with it is all that white people can see of him. Ellison's invisible man will be noticed because of his blackness, which is socially marked as aberrant, but he will not be seen beyond his blackness. Thus, when thinking about the invisible lives produced by the rural idyll, we should not just ask what living ghosts haunted, but also what living ghosts roam the rural without being counted as haunting presences, and how these presences may come to haunt after all. In addition, it is crucial to ask what kind of invisibility is involved and how it can be remedied. The process of editing out those elements of the rural that associate it against the rural idyll with modernity and globalization can take the form of excluding modern and globalized aspects of the rural, rendering them visible invisible. But it may also render these aspects avisual, which includes them as unseen. To counter avisuality, a mere making visible is not enough, as I will show by turning to Midsomer Murders. Midsomer Murders, as most of you will probably know, is an ITV crime drama set in a fictional conglomeration of villages in rural England, with a large viewership in the UK and around the world. Each episode features a murdered mystery, often involving multiple corpses, that is duly solved by Detective Chief Inspector Barnaby. According to Tiffany Burgin, Midsomer Murders evokes a strong sense of rural nostalgia, while also gently mocking its own idyllic portrayal of the English countryside. Burgin is right that Midsomer Murders parodies some elements of the idyll, and is generally not taken as a realistic portrayal of English rural life. However, by locating its departure from the rural idyll primarily in the large number of murders and the often ludicrous ways in which these occur, the series can still affirm the good life fantasy held out by the idyll. In fact, this fantasy is made to seem viable precisely by having those seen as not belonging in the idyll murdered, identified as murderers or murder suspects, or simply not appear at all. That Midsomer Murders is taken to contain a realistic kernel in its idyllic portrayal of village life as it unfolds around the murders became clear in 2011, when a row erupted after co-creator and producer Brian True May, in an interview with the Radio Times, noted, "We just don't have ethnic minorities involved because it wouldn't be the English village with them. It just wouldn't work. Suddenly we might be Slough." Ironically, Causton, which is the town in which Midsomer Murders police station is based, is supposed to be Slough. And if you went to Slough, you wouldn't see a white face there. We're the last bastion of Englishness, and I want to keep it that way. Here, the generalized English village is asserted to be exclusively white, and the specific city of Slough wholly non-white. Neither is accurate. English villages, including the ones where Midsomer Murders is filmed, are more diverse than True May allows. And although Slough is amongst the most ethnically diverse cities in the UK, the 2011 census identified it as 45.7% white. True May's heralding of Midsomer Murders' exclusively white villages as the last bastion of Englishness invokes the collapsing of rurality into whiteness that Sarah Neal links to the persistence of the rural idyll and its underpinning of English nationalism. The idyll constructs the rural and the nation of which it is regarded as the heart as a space of whiteness free from racial otherness. It represents a place of security away from the commonly perceived urban malaise of English cities, which have in the post-war period become increasingly diverse, un-English, and synonymous with an undesirable Black other. Strikingly, in Midsomer Murders, Causton, although supposedly modeled on Slough, is portrayed as just as white as the surrounding villages. Whiteness thus extends to the urban, erasing the contrast between the white English village and the non-white city upheld by True May. In this way, the whole fictional world of Midsomer Murders, and by implication the whole of England or even the UK, can be imagined as a realm safe from the undesirable Black other. The media storm caused by True May's statements led him to apologize for any unintended offense caused, but not to take back what he had said. He was suspended and then reinstated as series producer and eventually stepped down. The controversy highlighted how, until 2011, only one non-white character had appeared in 89 episodes of Midsomer Murders. In its wake, between 2011 and 2016, 24 ethnic minority characters appeared. While this may seem to signal a progressive move on the part of the series makers, merely including previously visible, invisible ethnic minority lives is not enough to allow them to come to haunt the rural in a transformative way that would account for the racist operation through which they were kept hidden. As Paul Cloak shows, rurality has been linked with racial purity, not on the basis of the actual absence of ethnic minorities from the rural, but on the basis of their elision from official histories. When people from ethnic minorities visit or live in the countryside, they are taken to represent unusual intrusions into the conventional cultural norms of rural life. As the Black author Andrea Levy recalls, I always get the feeling when I walk into a country pub that everyone is looking at me, whether they are or not. You are glowing with color. This glowing with color marks the hypervisibility associated with the non-image of the avisual, with being unseen through a racist visual structure as more than a Black body that cannot belong to the rural idyll. Cloak recounts how racialized others are subjected to an imperative of assimilation that seeks to bleach their cultural identity, but emphasizes that submitting to this imperative will not prevent them from encountering extreme and banal racisms. In order to ensure a more socially inclusive future, what should be highlighted are not just minority ethnic bodies in the rural, but the process through which they are rendered visible, invisible, or avisual by the continuing reign of the rural idyll. Notably, 22 of the 24 minority ethnic characters that appeared on Midsomer Murders between 2011 and 2016 were in mixed race relationships with white characters, suggesting that minority ethnic lives can only belong in the idyllic English village if they are bound to whiteness. In addition, the series has not featured narratives of racism. Characters are killed for many reasons, but racism has not been a possible motive, with the significant exception of racism against travelers, whose undesirable whiteness is thematized in the 1999 episode Blood Will Out. While a blogger noted of a 2012 episode featuring several British Asian characters that the plot gives credit to the audience by never pandering to an idea that racism and distaste of mixed relationships could be behind any suspicions of motivations for murder, in effect, the inclusion of minority ethnic characters in the rural idyll without making visible rural racism reaffirms the view of the English countryside as a deracialized realm. As Neil and Agyemon write, the biggest barrier to addressing racism in the countryside is white people's denial that it exists. Neil sees this refusal to recognize a race-rurality relationship as predicated on a notion that it is the presence of Black and minority ethnic populations which creates a race problem, and therefore without this presence, the issue of race is not relevant. What also plays a role is the denial of racism as a particularly violent structure of oppression that, in the rural as in the urban, has its roots in British colonial history. Instead of acknowledging this, rural racism is downplayed and separated from urban racism by subsuming it under the rural idyll's general hostility to all otherness, as happens in Anthony Horowitz's response to True May's statement. The point about Midsomer Murders is that in a village in Midsomer, all outsiders are equally unwelcome, whatever their color. If your family has lived there for 300 years, they're likely to be white. That's quite obvious. It was a foolish observation to make because color is not an issue. The rural idyll's association with the exclusion of everything non-familiar is used here to argue that the rural is not racist, but exclusionary in a colorblind, ahistorical way. As Neil notes, by claiming that there is a rural tradition of hostility to all outsiders, the processes of racism and racial hostility become no more than a centuries-old general reluctance to accept any newcomer. Pre-race row, Midsomer Murders presented the rural as a space of whiteness that extended to the urban and by implication to the entire nation. Ethnic minority lives were rendered visible invisible by being left out of the frame. Whereas in this period, the absence of ethnic minority characters at least drew attention, allowing them to exert a certain haunting force as an absence that some insisted mattered. Post-Race Row, the series was lauded by many for presenting a more ethnically diverse picture of British society. However, because of the lack of storylines in which their ethnicities or rural racism play a significant role, this ostensible inclusion masks the continued spectralization of ethnic minority people in the actual English countryside. Instead of allowing a disruptive haunting by those whom Midsomer Murders had previously rendered visible invisible that would make viewers truly see rural racism and its disabling effects, such a haunting was preempted by including ethnic minority lives as if they had never been kept secret and as if they seamlessly fit into the rural idyll. Because the newly introduced minority ethnic characters are whitewashed in every respect other than their appearance, the rural idyll of Midsomer does not have to wane, but can remain intact as a space of whiteness. I will now turn to Conan Jones's The Long Dry, which instead of reaffirming the traditional rural idyll, reinvents it as post-human. The Long Dry is the story of a day in the life of the Welsh farmer Gareth, his wife Kate, their children Dylan and Emmy, the rural community in which they live, and the animals on their farm, particularly a pregnant cow found to be missing in the early morning. Although the cow finds its way back to the farm, as Kate finds her way back to Gareth, from whom she has been estranged by a series of miscarriages caused by chlamydia transferred to Gareth in fluids from handling the sheep, and an affair with a farmhand who may have fathered Emmy, the novel's portrayal of the rural does not generate the sense of comfort associated with the rural idyll. While the story's setting is presented as eminently familiar to Gareth, who views himself as born to be on a farm, this is not an idyllic world limited and sufficient unto itself, where, in Bachtin's words, a sequence of generations is localized that is potentially without limit. The farm has not been in Gareth's family long. It was bought by his father, who used to be a banker, and might not be Gareth's for much longer, not only because he knew physically that he could not farm forever, but also because of financial strains linked to various regulations and the fact that the bank has globalized now. Moreover, the narrative proleptically tells of Emmy's death from eating a poisonous mushroom. 9 days from now, she will start to die, and emphasizes that Dylan has to want to get away from here. The farm, then, is far from a safe, self-sufficient world and unlikely to be transferred to the next generation. Gareth does hold out hope of buying more land to sell as plots for housing and of being able to rent out the top fields and some other land and keep the farm like an island without having to work it at all. However, the way most of the novel centers on past, present, and future deaths and losses, a pregnant girl who committed suicide, Kate's miscarriages, Gareth losing a finger in a farm accident, a neighbor losing his pig herd to swine flu, the botched mercy killing of a dying rabbit, ducks being shot, a dead mole, 2 cows losing a calf, the family dog being put down, and Emmy's impending death, marks this as cruel optimism. Even Gareth appears to realize that his plan is unlikely to be realized, as he concludes his thoughts of keeping the farm like an island, which would restore the safe little world of the idyll, but only in an openly artificial manner, as it would lack true self-sufficiency, with a resigned, things are exhausted. A sense of exhaustion pervades the narrative and is seen to have a paralyzing effect. At one point, Gareth wonders whether, if there was an outbreak of brucellosis in the herd, that would be the end of it, and they could start again. The exhaustion of doing the same thing every day would change. Gareth's anxious desire for something to end the stagnation involves the impasse, which Berlant defines as a stretch of time in which one moves around with a sense that the world is at once intensely present and enigmatic, such that the activity of living demands both a wandering, absorptive awareness and a hypervigilance that collects material that might help to clarify things and coordinate the standard melodramatic crises with those processes that have not yet found their genre of event. The rural lives portrayed in The Long Dry clearly no longer fit this genre of the rural idyll in its established form, but have not yet found a new genre that would allow them to stop oscillating between the cruel optimism that denies the impasse and the unease that dwelling within it entails. This new genre, The Long Dry insists, cannot be the anti-idyll, in which the rural appears as an arena of horror. Jones's novel does not render the deaths and losses it charts as gruesome aberrations, but as integral to rural life. They are described matter-of-factly and precipitate sadness and resignation, but not terror. The narrative also contains many moments of striking beauty, care, and love. On the whole, The Long Dry highlights the conventional rural idyll's inadequacy to rural reality and the difficulty of letting go of its good life fantasy. Yet it also suggests that some of the Idyll's elements remain pertinent to contemporary rural lives and can be built upon to make the genre more adequate to reality and more inclusive. Most notably, the novel affirms the Idyll's conjoining of human life with the life of nature in its indiscriminate charting of human and animal deaths, its metonymic linking of Kate's miscarriages to the two stillborn calves, and its juxtaposition of Garrett's wanderings and reflections with those of the missing cow. This positions the contemporary rural not so much as a realm in which the presence and centrality of the human is naturalized through its proximity to and cultivation of nature, as is the case in the conventional rural idyll, but as one in which the human and the natural are deeply intertwined. As such, the long dry invokes the possibility of a new genre of the post-human idyll that would render the rural, instead of as a human-centered safe little world where nothing unexpected can occur, as constituted by many agents engaged in an unpredictable process of what Barat calls intra-action. Intra-action, rather than presuming interaction between pre-existing bodies, implies that bodies are constituted in their entanglement as fundamentally relational. A passage from the long dry exemplifies this entanglement. The cow walked lazily up the track between two rails of blackthorn. She'd heard the vet come and go. She hadn't liked the bog, which for a long time had been full of hide-behinds, which were brought across from the lumber camps of Wisconsin, and which Garrett's father had learned about from the American troops he served with. No matter how quickly you turned around, how hard you looked for them, these creatures always stayed behind you, so no one had ever described them. The cow had only sensed them. She was slightly demented now. She felt she could give the calf, but her body wouldn't. It was a strange feeling to the cow. Here, the cow, the vet, the bog, the hide-behinds, the Wisconsin lumber camps, Garrett's father, the American troops stationed with him in Scotland in the Second World War, and the calf that the cow is carrying are all intra-acting agencies that, in a process of differentiation entanglement that cuts across space and time, bring into being a globalized rural where human and non-human life forms mutually affect each other, with the lumberjacks propelling the hide-behinds across the Atlantic and the hide-behinds disturbing human and cow alike. For Barat, intra-action is a haunting process, as it carries within it what might also have been. Matter is spectral, haunted by all impossible wanderings, an infinite multiplicity of histories, present-absent in the indeterminacy of time being. Allowing these what might have beens and the what could be's to haunt what has momentarily sedimented as the present moment opens up possibilities for reconfiguration and consistently presses the question of what is rendered absent or unseen and by whom. The way in which the cow's purported reflections are put at the same level as Garrett's by the long dry's intricate narrative structure, characterized by frequent, barely marked shifts in focalization that often confuse the reader as to whose experience is being conveyed, to the point of being almost seamlessly merged in the above passage, which is partly focalized by the cow and partly by Garrett, remembering his father's diary, mentioning his hearing about the hide-behinds, exemplifies the novel's reconfiguration of the rural idyll as post-human. This post-human idyll assigns a presence that counts to those non-human life forms on and around the farm, down to the hide-behinds and the chlamydia bacteria going from the sheep to Garrett, to Kate and her unborn children, which the conventional rural idyll, as a staunchly anthropocentric genre, turned into living ghosts unable to haunt. Ben Smith's Doggerland pushes Barat's question about whether absence is not always a question of what is seen, acknowledged, and counted as present, and for whom, beyond the for whom to the for what. decentering the human from the idyll in an even more radical manner than the long dry. The novel presents a dystopian future in which a boy and a man have been charged by the company, which appears to be the only company left in the world, with maintaining a wind farm in the North Sea without adequate supplies. The idyll is conjured in the extreme monotony of their existence, with every day being like the previous one and nothing ever changing, and in the explicit comparison of the wind farm to an agricultural farm. The fields stretched out around him, row after row of turbines, like strange crops. From a distance, they all looked identical, but up close, each tower was marked with dark blooms and scabs of rust. There were seepages of oil and grease creeping downward, streaks of salt corrosion reaching up, forming intricate patterns of stalactites and stalagmites. Some of the turbines had slumped down at an angle, their foundations crumbling like silt. The wind farm, like Bachtin's idyll, is a space of extreme familiarity, but this familiarity generates frustration and despair rather than comfort. It is a space of generations living the same life. The boy was forced to move to the wind farm to fulfill his father's contractual obligations to the company after the father disappeared from the farm. But the life lived is so impoverished that it is barely a life at all. It is without progression. The boy is no longer a boy, but has no idea how old he is or how long he has been on the farm, and his memories of life before the farm are fading. And without future, as there seems to be no chance of the boy and the man procreating, while life on the land, which they hear about from the man who supplies them with food, is getting bleaker and bleaker. The boy and the man are not the contented farmers of the traditional idyll living the good life, but living ghosts trapped in a condition of indentured servitude. As such, their story highlights how farm labor is often not undertaken by the farmer owner, but by farmhands, or in the context of the plantation, slaves, living ghostly, unremembered lives. The boy is preoccupied with getting off the wind farm and nearly succeeds when he manages to forge a sail for the motorboat they use to service the turbines. However, he ends up exchanging the sailboat for medicine for the old man who has fallen ill, and the novel ends, as it began, with the boy fishing off the side of the rig they live on, knowing that he is unlikely to catch any fish. All that is left in the ocean is waste, but nonetheless persisting and maintaining hope of an escape, since they had a lot of time on their hands, and the strange fish he finds at the end of his line may turn out to have their uses. This is not cruel optimism, as there is no real sense that this time the outcome will be different. It is rather a survival mode, oriented not towards a good life fantasy, but towards having a life despite everything. Doggerland does not present an anti-idyll, but an idyll estranged, defamiliarized, in a mode that, as in the long dry, can be seen as post-human. The rural in Doggerland is despectralized and literally shown to be at sea. Human cultivation, here in the form of the strange crops of the wind turbines, has lost its bearings and is being undone. The first culprit, it is suggested, is global capitalism, represented by the company and the waste bearing the logos of its predecessors that saturates the sea and has replaced its plant and animal life. The novel is an indictment of the excesses of global capitalism, of its egregious human and environmental cost. However, it also subsumes the history of the Capitalocene to a much longer history in which it is the non-human, which was here before the human, and the novel implies will be here after the human, that is ultimately the strongest force. In the novel, chapters narrated from the perspective of the boy, conveyed by a third-person narrator, are interspersed with chapters dated 8,200 before present, 20,000 before present, 14,000 before present, 11,000 before present, 9,500 before present, 8,500 before present, and finally year 0, which is the novel's present. In some of these chapters, humans or their actions make a mark, but these marks are always in the process of being undone by the relentless forces of water and wind, as the last chapter emphasizes. Year 0. At some point, blocks were laid down to stabilize the seabed. Posts and rods were driven in. Metal was stacked on metal. Towers rose from the water like the trunks of long-forgotten trees. The trees grew branches. The wind blew and the branches turned. The wind blew and the branches thumbed and turned. Cables spread like roots. Energy gathered and spread. When did this happen? Maybe centuries ago. Nothing more than a blink in the lifetime of water. But they are here, and so water continues its work of leveling, of pressing at edges, of constantly seeking a return to an even surface, a steady state. It finds its way through cracks and rivets. It scrapes away metal, millimeter by millimeter. It chips paint and crumbles rubber seals. It finds new ways to make things bloom. Sometimes it finds its work undone. A crack is filled, a panel is reinforced. But the water is patient. It's been doing this for a long time. The wind blows, the branches creak and turn. Somewhere in the metal forest, a tree slumps, groans, but does not quite fall. The landscape holds fast for a moment. For how long? It may be centuries, barely worth mentioning in the lifetime of water. This narrative of deep time spectralizes the company and humankind, intimating that when humans work against nature, against the survival of the earth, their efforts will ultimately always be in vain. Perhaps this belief in the power of nature makes the novel guilty of another form of cruel optimism in the face of climate change's threat to the earth as a whole. But we could also see it as another way of placing history itself in the forces of nature by way of the rural, to return to Spivak's discussion of José Martí. In both the human scale story of the man and the boy, and in the story of the North Sea unfolding on a vastly larger time scale, Doggerland draws the reader's attention to the human and non-human living ghosts of the contemporary globalized rural, and to their strategies of survival, which repurpose the Idyll's cyclical, apparently uneventful temporality, which seems to preclude change, as capable in its patient relentlessness of forging a life out of no life and of undoing centuries of capitalist extraction. What is needed to counter the spectralization of the rural diagnosed by Spivak and to ensure the rural Idyll's waning are new genres more adequate to the globalized rural and capable of including those living ghosts rendered visible invisible or assigned to the avisual by the Rural Idyll. Such inclusion, my discussion of Midsomer Murders has made clear, cannot stop at merely making these living ghosts visible, but needs to make seen how they have been and continue to be marginalized. Only then can they come to exert a haunting force capable of inciting social change. The long dry, I have argued, thematizes the waning of the rural idyll, the unattainability of its good life fantasy, and the tendency to nonetheless hold on to this fantasy with cruel optimism, while also reconfiguring the idyll beyond anthropocentrism. Doggerland, finally, presents a defamiliarized idyll that even more radically decenters the human by envisioning, in a deep time narrative, nature eroding all man-made structures. At the same time, within its human scale narrative of global capitalism's spectralization of the land and the workers it expends, the novel highlights that living ghosts manage to build lives and maintain relations of care and hope despite their dispossession and inability to haunt society as a whole. Making this visible is one way of allowing these ghosts to haunt beyond the borders of their lives, beyond the wind farm from which there is no escape, and beyond the pages of the novel in a society hurtling towards the kind of future, or rather no future, that Doggerland sketches. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther. It was a wonderful presentation. It was very interesting to follow it all through. I wonder if someone in the audience have some question or some comment that would like to make or propose. So I have some of my own, and maybe I will start by. I found this idea of rural Idyll, as you propose, very interesting, and it reminds me of an idea I think was proposed by Dana Haraway, or Dana Haraway was discussing this idea around someone else about this idea of the fact that the Western civilizations and Western cultures are very dependent on origin stories, on stories of an origin, and which here could stand for the origin of the British, not Britishness, but Englishness. And on the other hand, I would like to, if you could comment, if you think this topic could be relevant for us to think about all around the discussion of the end of history and the end of having this perfect idealized past. If it could be interesting for us to discuss the end of making history and the end of historicism as it has been discussed in recent times.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think there's definitely a link between the idyll and a kind of origin story, although in a funny way, the cyclical temporality of the idyll also moves away from the linearity of looking for a definite origin, but it also kind of allows us to not think about where things originated, and also about where things might end. And I think this relates to your question about the end of history, and particularly the end of history as we are now kind of conceptualizing it in the light of the climate change emergency, right? So I feel that the idyll fulfills a lot of affective functions for a lot of people in allowing them to get away from discussions about, on the one hand, responsibility for the afterlives of historical violences, because if you take on the cyclicality of the idyll, and if you buy into its kind of idealization of homogeneity and a kind of closed off society, that allows you to not have to think about all the ways in which our societies, particularly Western European colonial societies, have been not like that at all. And I think here it's interesting, for example, that recently the National Trust in England, which is the organization that maintains a lot of the old country estates for tourism, where people can go and visit the English idyll, not just a village, but also a country mansion. The National Trust is now running a project that's looking into the colonial histories of its properties and of the land that it owns. And a lot of people in Britain have been really critical of this and really angered by this, because taking away the fantasy that these national trust properties can be enjoyed in a kind of innocence that doesn't make you consider their histories and the violences that were involved with those histories. I think that's very telling about what exactly the idyll provides a lot of people with, and why it's so difficult for people to move away from it. And it's the same when we look at the future, because I think the idyll allows us to imagine an escape from the excesses of globalization, but also from the impending disaster of climate change, that then removes the responsibility of actually having to act in the face of this danger.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a question by Ulrich Baer. Ulrich, would you like to join us in with video and audio?
Yes, I can. Hi. Hi. Thank you
Hi,
so much.
Ulrich. So nice to see you again after so many years.
I know it's been a long time. So thank you so much. So my question is really about maybe the terms that I can't really find the right terms. So whether a goal would be inclusion of, let's say in this specific case of this crime series of non-white actors, that they would no longer be included as other, but just centered. Because of course we have a history of, from Frankenstein to Jane Eyre, of the presence of non-white people. And so this, what you're saying, this kind of reaction to England coming to terms with its past and the backlash, but what would be the right way to include such individuals in a TV series, for example, that they would just show up as not remarkable, not marked as different? So I'm just interested in the terms, and I don't know, the terms are very fraught. Would it be integration? Would it be acceptance? So I'm really curious, but I love the way you sort of put into question the idea of the Idyll and then the Anthropocene in these different novels. So thank you so much. And then I get back off screen because I'll have to move around here, but I really thank you. And I'm just curious about the proper terms of what would be a goal, like how could we account for the ghost in a proper way? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, there would be two ways, I guess, of including the ghost in a proper way. And one would be what I was sort of trying to talk about in relation to Midsomer Murders, which would be including them as marginalized and excluded. Because I think what was the problem with the way Midsomer Murders tried to include ethnic minority characters after the big controversy was that they were included as visually members of ethnic minorities, but not as having storylines that actually went into their lives as ethnic minorities in the rural, which would necessitate some sort of accounting also for the rural racism that a lot of rural geographers have empirically established as part of what it is like to be an ethnic minority in the British rural. So as long as these characters are included in Midsomer Murders in a way in which there's actually no real accounting for what the life of an actual ethnic minority person in the rural would be like, it's not productive in my view. It's actually counterproductive because you get a sort of post-racial fantasy of the rural as a place where race really doesn't matter, because the characters in Midsomer Murders could be any color. So as long as their actual stories as marginalized in society are taken into account, I think that's not a good way to include them. So you would have to show them as being rendered avisual, as being ghosted or invisibilized by the structural racism that is a factor in these rural environments. And then the second way would be to center them, as you said. And I think that's something that, for example, Steve McQueen in his recent television series Small Axe tried to do. And I think what was really powerful about that series was that Black characters were centered. It was their stories that were being told, but it was their stories and experiences as Black people in the UK that were being centered. So it wasn't their stories in such a way that it didn't matter that they were Black people in the UK, because their whole lives are marked by the fact that they are Black people in the UK, and that they get treated, and that they get seen or unseen in particular ways by the rest of society. What was interesting about Small Axe was that all of the stories, and I think there were 5 episodes, were set in the urban. And so there was a very strong linking in that TV series of Black life with urban life. And I think there is still some work to do in Britain in accounting for Black lives as they have been going on in the rural. And there may not have been as large communities of Black people in the rural, as there have been in the urban, but I still think there are important and illuminating stories to be told about the experiences of Black people and other ethnic minorities in rural Britain that are now not being told, and that are certainly not helped in any way by a fantasy of post-racial harmony in the rural, which is what Midsomer Murders post-race row tends to show. I see questions in the chat, but it's very difficult for me to also pay attention to the screen. So maybe I should read.
Margarida Medeiros, would you like to join the conversation? I think we would.
Okay. I was, hello.
Hi. Nice to see you again too.
Many years later. I was thinking that there was in the last few years there was a moving in Portugal from England of lots of people to the interior of the country, to rural little villages, and I was asking that if it was a way of turning back to the rural invasion by Black and ethnic minorities that of course is going on in England. In spite of the Midsomer Murder series and the idealizing a rural country, it seems that there is a reality that is coming in, and English people don't like it.
No, I think it would be interesting to look at the sort of large numbers of British people who have been moving not just to the Portuguese countryside, but also, for example, the French countryside. And of course, this was pre-Brexit, so we'll have to see how it develops now. And it's also very interesting that a lot of these people would not see themselves as immigrants. They wouldn't define themselves as immigrants. They wouldn't define themselves as in any way disrupting the kind of village life of the French countryside or of the Portuguese countryside. I do think that even within Britain, the Rural Idyll is still a very strong idea, and it's not just in Midsomer Murders. But if you watch British TV, you can spend almost your entire day watching programs about the rural.
Curious about rural countries and
exactly.
Houses. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, and it's been. I mean, I've been fascinated by how during the COVID pandemic, these programs have just been going on, and in these programs there has been very little attention to the COVID pandemic and very little dealing with it in terms of its effect on the rural. And whereas these effects have actually been quite strong, I think this shows that these programs are really an escapism that is aimed at urban audiences that just want to get away from it all. So that people want to keep seeing these villages. They want to keep having this idea that somewhere there is a part of the country that they could conceivably go back to that would take away all the problems that they are having in their lives, and that would restore a kind of mythical Englishness that they really deeply desire, particularly in England. I think there's interesting regional and national discrepancies between how the countryside is seen in Scotland, for example, and in Wales and in Northern Ireland. And this is why it's important that The Long Dry is actually a Welsh set novel, because I think the more bleak perspective it offers on the rural also has to do with the history of colonialism in Wales, and the history of farming not always being a particularly prosperous practice.
Yeah, it works. It keeps working. Very critical.
Exactly, and I think what interests me is the affective attachment that many people have to the idyll and to the rural as an escape, and how in that, and that's why I think it does have a very strong relation to spectrality for me, because it means that the rural is at once a kind of haunted realm where a lot of histories are actually not showing up in a very strong manner that people want to engage with, but it's also itself kind of a ghostly structure that keeps going around and circulating in society in a way that I think is quite harmful. So as opposed to ghosts that we want to haunt us because there are issues of social justice and reparations and repairing violent histories involved, I think the rural idyll is a ghost that we would need to get rid of, really, but it's very difficult to shed. It's like those stereotypical horror films where the ghost is kind of conquered at the end and then always comes back again.
Yeah, I remember that one of the main goals of the fascist state in Portugal was to construct an idyllic rural vision, which was completely scattered from reality, because the reality of the rural camps was completely poor and devastated by poorness, and it was described by a great writer, a Portuguese writer, as a place of tragedy and of crime and everything which was bad, because there was so much poverty. And the state always was inflicting these ideas of the rural, like with the camps and the animals, and like in magazines, a very idyllic idea of the Portuguese country. It was very strong as a task for the state. This construction of the country as an ideal place.
Yeah, you see that in China also under Mao, for example, where you have this kind of glorification of the countryside. Interestingly, the Chinese state now is very much oriented towards rapid urbanization and portraying the countryside as a kind of backwards area that desperately needs to catch up with modernization. But on the other hand, in China too, we see a kind of upsurge in a kind of nostalgic rural tourism, which plays on the same kind of sentiments as the idyll in Britain and in other parts of Europe. This also interests me very much, how the idyll is kind of a globalized genre now. It comes very much from a European tradition, of course, going back to the classics, but it's also spread around the world as a kind of globalized genre of escapism. I think that plays a similar, that fulfills a similar function in different societies.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Hi, Esther. I think you are going to see me. I just have a couple of comments and maybe an idea that I want also to comment. Actually, one of the things that I was remembering is that we also have a Portuguese soap opera that takes place in the rural countryside, which is Diário de Beirais. I never saw it, but I know that exists, and it was really important in the Portuguese television. But that's not what I want to address now. I really liked your cultural framework. I'm also I think Lauren Berlin is really, really powerful in terms of this concept of good life and cruel optimism. So thank you for bringing that and connecting with other ideas. But I was thinking when you were giving some examples on those two novels, I was thinking a little bit on how contemporary cinema can also do the work of going to, how to say, reveal and give a sense of these post-human worlds and this idea of breaking the invisibility of what you were saying. And I was thinking a little bit on the work of the Sensory Ethnography Lab at Harvard University. I don't know if you are aware of those films, especially Leviathan by Lucian Castaigne-Taylor and Verena Paravel. And I think, in fact, some of those films that work a kind of sensory ethnography that are giving us an alternative view of the world, and also a view that is connected also with the device of cinema, because they use the tools of cinema in a way that we can go forward against these kind of devices that the series that you were talking about does. I don't know if you can comment on this idea of sensory cinema or how contemporary cinema can do the things that you are talking about. Thanks.
I'm not familiar with the sensory ethnography lab, but I will definitely look them up now and watch some of their work. I mean, I certainly think cinema has the same potential as literature to come up with new genres for envisioning the rural in a way that moves away from the idyll, and that moves in the direction of a more post-human world of entanglements between different agencies. I do feel that both in literature and in cinema, it always worries me a little that these kind of experiments are taking place a little bit in the kind of art cinema and kind of high literature corner, so that the audiences for these kinds of really intriguing and really nuanced and really layered and hopeful reimaginings is often not very big. And this is why in my work I've always looked a lot towards popular culture, because I feel that if there are, like 10 people who see an art film, whereas like millions of people watch Midsomer Murders every week, then I wonder how far we're going to get with these new genres. So I really do believe that there has to be also an attempt to translate maybe some of the more experimental ways of storytelling and ways and genres that we see in literature and in art cinema, and also in art, in visual art, in the plastic arts, and even in music, but to translate those into formats that are also appealing to the average television viewer, because I do feel that as long as the old genres keep being so dominant in popular culture that is consumed by very large numbers of people, it's not the kind of alternatives are not going to do very much, are not going to have a great impact. And I feel that trying to find a way to bring these new genres and new ideas more into the mainstream is very important. And also looking for the stories in popular culture that are maybe not perfect, but that have certain elements in which they bring out also sometimes unexpectedly other stories of the rural, for example, or of climate change, or of histories of violence and their afterlives.
Carlos has a question over there.
It's so nice to see the audience.
Oh, thank you for your wonderful talk. I was thinking from when you were describing this idea of rural idyll, it's very interesting. It kind of made me, well, when the thing is, if I understood correct, is to question this idea of Englishness as well. I find it interesting because there's this tension between idyll and the idea that I think you mentioned in one of the replies, the idea of horror that comes from the idea of ghosts also, and also this tension between a place for refuge and a place of safety in a way. So, and it kind of remind me, it's not a question, it's a commentary. It may remind me of two trends that are very visible in contemporary horror. One is the idea of not on my backyard horror films, which is the protagonists are inside their safe homes. So in their safe homes, there's this refuge against the enemy, and the enemy is the other in this competitive neoliberalist society. So there's a lot of films that work on this creation of a pure space between commas. And the second one, which is not exactly the same, which is horror also, American horror, also works very much between the separation, works very much the separation between the cosmopolitan and the rednecks. So the rednecks as being someone weird and frightening. So this is just a comment, if you think there's any kind of connection between these, trying to craft these spaces of separation where one side you have like this idea of purity and safety, and on the other side you have the menace of the other. So, thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think there is a very long tradition of horror films set in the rural that do what I would say is create an anti-idyll, where the rural becomes a realm of complete horror and backwardness and extreme fear, and also extreme hostility to the urban, and the urban specifically in the form of the sort of cosmopolitan, usually white person. And the standard example is, of course, Deliverance, which I have to say remains one of the most horrible films I have ever seen. But my feeling is that those films are ultimately also still invoking the idyll as the idealized rural, because they always play upon the way in which these cosmopolitans are going to the rural to find this ideal realm, and then they are confronted by utter horror. And in a way that doesn't do that much to actually change the perception of the rural towards a visibilization of the elements of the rural that we now never really get to see. And I think, for example, the fact that there are lots of these horror films in the US, but very few of them, for example, deal with the history of slavery, which of course largely unfolded in rural areas on plantations. And a film like Get Out is a film that, to me, does do something with that history, and thereby is much more productive than a film like Deliverance, which once again completely invisibilizes the racial dimension of rurality, especially in the United States. So I feel that redneck, the sort of stereotype of the rural redneck, has also been used in a way to not have to deal with racially charged histories that took place in the rural. And I think that my work is mostly really about always asking, so what are we not getting to see? So which genres are there? What do these genres emphasize and highlight? And what do these genres never really allow us to see? And there are many structures, I think, in the rural that even when we take a broader view of genres of the rural that exist, are not becoming visible. For example, there are a lot of prisons in the rural, and that the sort of rural situatedness of prisons is not really something that is engaged with very much. You see it a little bit in a series like Orange is the New Black, because there's some engagement with the fact that this prison that they're in is actually situated in quite a rural area, but it's not fully engaged with again. And I feel that this is what we need to be looking for. And also things like mega farms. I mean, how many films or television series are there that really engage with the type of extremely large scale farming that is now dominant in rural areas in many parts of the world? And we don't see that. We don't see the stories of the humans and the animals that live in these kinds of contexts. So for me, when I think about the rural and spectrality and haunting, for me, what strikes me always is how many things are happening in the rural and have happened in the rural in the past that are not allowed to haunt us, that we don't allow to become disturbing forces around us, and how we tend to prefer to not engage with these ghosts. And I think that was the main point of my lecture, that when I was writing the spectral metaphor, I was very much still believing that if you made certain groups of people more visible, then that would be enough to sort of do something about the situation. If people would only be informed about certain communities, then they would also be treated better. But I think I've now shifted to thinking really that making things visible is not enough. You have to want to engage with the discomfort of particular ghosts. And we see that also with something like Black Lives Matter, I think, where it's not that these issues were not known. It's not that there haven't been accounts for years and years and years of Black people being killed by the police and histories of racial injustice. It's that somehow at this moment, there's a certain resonating of the issues that Black Lives Matter is highlighting with wider society. That means that now there is a kind of receptivity amongst a lot of people to really taking this as a haunting force and really taking responsibility for engaging with it and really allowing it to make us uncomfortable and to make us ask ourselves really difficult questions and really try to change our behavior. But how we can know when that potential for resonance is there and how we can try to make that potential happen is something that I'm still questioning, because that would make it possible to really allow certain ghosts to haunt if you could pinpoint how you could make people receptive to particular ghosts instead of allowing them to be disavowed. Sorry, my answers are very long. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Professor Esther. It was a we will sure also keep this questioning ourselves after your inspiring talk. And thank you very much for your talk again. And we move on to the next panel. We will have a short break of 15 minutes, and we will be back with the last panel of this year's edition of Spring Seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.